Remember when I said that Fitzroy always had an elite player on their list? Like a legendary figure who, at the very least, was a captain of Victoria and at the very best was, well, the GOAT? Well, I lied. For 1965 and 1966, Kevin Murray, after his 5th consecutive best and fairest, left for a stint in Western Australia. With memories of the Baron rapidly fading and most of the super exciting 1980s Lions side still in nappies, it left a void up top. While Bill Stevens stepped in to coach, ensuring a legend was still at least on the team sheet, the best player running around now was the phenomenally mediocre Gary Lazarus. The Roy's sure could use a resurrection right about now. Sadly, they would receive the exact opposite. Big Kev eventually returned, but while he was away, the Roys would be set on the path to their own destruction.
8 clubs joined the VFL in 1897. Each, of course, had a home ground, but their relationships to them were different. Carlton had just moved into Princes Park as opposed to Melbourne, who'd been at the G for yonks. They'd started out somewhere else, though, on the adjacent Richmond paddock, unlike St Kilda, who'd began at Junction Oval. However, this had been shared with South during the war when St Kilda weren't at Toorak Park, and they just moved out to Moorabbin last year. Essendon had to vacate the EMCG when it was torn down in the 1920s, and even Geelong had moved. Collingwood had been 5 years old when invited along to the league, so although they'd been in Victoria Park for their entirety of their existence, it hadn't been so for as long as one club had lived in its first home. Fitzroy, after the 1965 season, were the single longest running tenants in the league that hadn't yet moved house. While others had moved for political reasons or to consolidate power or because they wanted shiny new toys, Fitzroy did something very Fitzroy and just stayed where they were because, well, that's where they were. That's where their fans were. That's where their family was. The family that, despite the results going the wrong way recently, had continued to give constant support, at least those who paid for tickets, unlike the seeming majority who found a way to hop the sky blue fences in just the right place. But sadly, this couldn't last forever. The Lions' on-field results weren't the only part of the club that was collapsing. Their iconic home, Brunswick Street Oval, was in dire need of upgrades by this point, and maintenance in particular. In fact, let's be real, we like to wear rose-tinted glasses when talking about old grounds, but this was an absolute shithole. No, really, just ask anyone who played or spectated there. Kids had to stand on beer cans just to see the play through the sardine tin of people that was the Cityside wing, and had to surf above crowd crush when leaving through the narrow passageways to the Brunswick Street gates. The walls were too close to the ground all around, meaning that you couldn't move around, while most of the balls kicked through the goals sailed over the fences, rendering them forever lost to the Thatcher-esque wandering working-class urchins who inevitably stole away with, I think, half the Sherrins ever produced. That kind of helped the overheads. The grandstands weren't much better. The cricket stand is exactly the same now as it was then, give or take some graffiti, and it's no postcard now. The toilets made World War I latrines look like innovative new technology. The visitors' change room was basically a broom cupboard. The offices were actual broom cupboards. The whole place fucking reeked of the sort of smells you'd get in Dante's Circles of Hell. And then we get to the ground itself. The cricket club used soil from nearby Merry Creek for its pitch, which was great in the dry. In the wet, though, it turned into cloying mud that didn't just stick to your boots and clothes, but to your very essence. Essendon registered a complaint once, which, considering how their ground was basically the interior of a Dyson cyclonic vacuum chamber, tells you all you need to know. It wasn't just unsafe, it wasn't just unfit for VFL footy, it was unfit for human habitation. However, like a few clubs, the Lions were beholden to the cricket club that occupied it and performed groundskeeping works. The MCC-VFA feud of the 1880s had by now turned into an entrenched war that sought out grounds as trophies for its participants. Footy clubs resented the cricket clubs digging up the middle of the ground for a pitch that hurt to run and land on, while cricket clubs resented footy clubs for turning their pristine, beautiful ovals into muddy battlegrounds that resembled the Somme by winter in the typical Melbourne rains. Brunswick Street was no different. The cricket club refused to make the improvements that the Lions and the VFL requested. The Roys tried to amalgamate with the cricketers to create a Carlton-like situation, but the cricketers steadfastly refused. There was only one option left to save their home ground: turn to the council for help. Now, the council had always had an antagonistic relationship to sports on the ground for reasons that haven't really survived the test of time. Maybe they were upset at clubs keeping large swathes of revenue for what was essentially publicly reserved land. That's my best guess. Bill Jacobs says this is emphasised by the Oval now being named after not a cricketer or one of the many legends of the Fitzroy Football Club, but a councillor. Yeah, good for W.T. Patterson. He served 21 years on the council. Kevin Murray served 60 years in this prison and got nothing. Anyway, despite a raft of proposals, including a pavilion with shops on the entrance terrace, the council refused to provide the $400,000 loan required for improvements and only gave a 21-year lease. Negotiations failed. The Lions would lose their one and only home.
The Lions went to nearby Preston and asked for their ground, but were turned down. They had no choice. They had to leave their home of 80 years. Of course, they weren't the only team to be forced down this route by a cricket club.
St Kilda were being similarly extorted by the cricket club that controlled Junction Oval. Neil Roberts would later opine that the surface at the Junction was the best in the VFL, which is backed up by various newspaper reports dating back to the Alpaca Park days. Players loved it because you had so much space to operate in. If you couldn't get a kick here, it was said, you couldn't get a kick anywhere. Fitzroy had historically loved Junction Oval as well. Not only did they have a favourable record here, thank you St Kilda, but they'd won grand finals on this ground. Some of their best moments had occurred here. It only made sense that if they couldn't stay at Brunswick, they'd make their home up the Junction. So for 1967, the Royals would play at Prince's Park. Wait, what? Oh, yeah. It was just easier to ground share with Carlton at a ground that was already fitted out for footy. Prince's Park was far from poor. It was the first choice to be the main stadium for the 1956 Olympics until the IOC saw sense and moved to the G, plus it was pretty close to Fitzroy's home. However, Carlton charged quite the pretty penny to lease out their ground. Still, it was unfortunately better than a dilapidated old ground that, thanks to the cricket club, had a big old no footballers sign right up the front of it. Round 17, 1966, the 609th and final time that Fitzroy, or indeed any side, would play VFL at Brunswick Street, and it was against those Saints. In any other year, the beleaguered Roys would have a great chance against the least successful club that's existed as long as I have, but this was 1966. St Kilda had just emerged from the shadows following their Moorabbin move and became giants. Thanks to St Kilda's 7 first-term scores, all avoiding the gap in the middle, Fitzroy held an 11-point first-term lead, but the Roy boys only scored 7 more times as the Saints galloped away. With Butch Gale in the commentary box instead of in the ruck, Morrow and Minot dominated, and 4 goals to Neil and Davis led the Saints to a 14-goal demolition. In their final season at Brunswick Street, their only win, not just at home but at all, was a 6-point squeaker against an awful Bulldogs 2 weeks before. But St Kilda in particular had showed that moving out of their long-term home could mature a team and bring them results. So, new ground, new team, right? Appropriately enough, Fitzroy's first home game of 1967 was against Carlton in round 1. The Roys showed the suburb of Carlton what they were all about by failing to score until the second term and losing by over 10 goals. The crowd of nearly 25,000 buoyed the club until the next home fixture just showed how many of those were there to see Carlton. 9,747 people. Jesus Christ. Fitzroy's lowest home crowd since... that Bulldogs game. That's not good. Well, the crowd that I'm assuming was just the players' friends came in hope to see Fitzroy somehow land another miracle against Geelong. They got pancaked. Fitzroy failed to win until they saw the Dogs again in round 8. They then managed to turn a 4-point lead into a miracle 53-point demolition of South in their first home win at Prince's Park, but it was in round 12. Some late wins spiked a surge that attempted to see them clear of yet another spoon, but they lost to last-placed Hawthorn. The Dogs also lost by less than Fitzroy did, sealing a last-round drop of 2 places to last. This hasn't happened in any other year. Probably.
In '68, they won their first 2 home games, including beating the damn Magpies, but only won 2 of the next 14 fixtures to only just avoid a spoon three-peat. 1969 saw yet another scuffed season with a way too long losing streak, but this came with the silver lining of an individual honour. I've touched on Kevin Murray's journey to the Brownlow medal, a much-loved player at 31. He was used to losing in more ways than one. Not only had he pulled up agonisingly short of the game's biggest honour time after time, but he'd also just piled up regular old L's. In 1969, no one had really played in a ton of losses. Bad teams rarely had good players who stayed around a heap, and if they did, they typically didn't make it to the 250 game milestone. Alan Aylett and again Harold Bray are great examples of this. But Murray's longevity, even in only 18 game seasons, which very rarely saw him play finals, had seen him not only play 223 games to this point, or 250 if you include his WA stint, but remain fresh doing so. He would play on until 1974, playing every game that season even as he turned 36. This not only meant he broke the league games played record with 333, thus taking Fitzroy's Mark II, which he will hold forever, but thanks to playing in only 42 Fitzroy wins across the whole 1960s, he lost 208 of those games, breaking Teddy Whitten's record by a whole 15%. Only Cade Simpson, stoic veterans of 2 generations of dreadful Carlton sides, played in more, taking until 2020 to take the record with 215. No one will ever beat this, mainly because no one will ever stay at the Suns long enough. Count Murray's time at East Perth and his number jumps to 226. In seniors footy, only Ralph Sewer, a victim of Woodville's ineptitude across 4 decades, beats that tally at 229, 3 more from the same amount of games. However, Murray wasn't done. He went on to captain coach Sandringham in the VFA and appeared 5 times across 3 years. He won the first but lost the next 3, 229 losses. His final appearance, round 19, 1976 at Port Melbourne at the tender young age of 291. Sandringham stay close all day, but Fred Cook, who would finish on 1,255 VFA goals, saves his very best performance for this match. 14 goals gives Port the win, and Murray his 230th and final loss as a player, more than any other senior footy player this country has ever seen. But even today, he is still a staunch and ever-present figure of Fitzroy, wearing his Brownlow medal around wherever he goes, and not as a flex, mind. No, he wears it so that if someone happens to recognise him and wants a photo, he gives them the medal to wear. It's the people that got him that medal, he says, and he takes immense joy and pride in the emotions that fans have when they get to drape it around their own neck. Even into his 80s, he remained a fantastic club ambassador, and his seal of endorsement on the eventual merger went a long way to ensuring that Brisbane had a large and healthy supporter base in Melbourne. Of course, the best and fairest half being named after him helped that a lot as well. There was more good news to come in 1969 as well. Fitzroy's stay at Princes Park had been a disaster. They didn't get along well with their neighbours, and not having their own facilities really hurt their fundraising opportunities. Of course, their preferred option was Brunswick Street, but the council were being a nightmare again, so that wasn't happening. So an unlikely ally came to help them out. North had, if you'll remember, recently moved back from Coburg's Oval after a disastrous year, with A.V. Fons Tobin trying to move them to the Junction instead of returning to Arden Street. Tobin got sacked for that, but he'd redeem himself by suggesting to a man named Harry Meese, "Hey, you know, Junction's a good spot."
Remember Junction Oval? Well, half a decade after kicking St Kilda out, they had seller's remorse. Turns out a footy club brings a lot of income to a sporting ground, and seeing St Kilda instantly achieve their only success right after leaving here must have rankled the folks who ran the place. So, noticing the Roys were looking for a better deal, they gave them one. Fitzroy would get a third of all car parking money, a significant sum and a damn sight more than Carlton were handing out. Plus, the Albert Park Trust, who really wanted all of this to work, gave them a huge loan to make upgrades to the seating. The ground was as immaculate as it had ever been, and Fitzroy were very keen to use facilities for themselves, and these were very good facilities. This wasn't Brunswick Street with bloody trench warfare style dugouts and that sort of thing. Almost instantly, they managed to make a deal that the Fitzroy Cricket Club were never willing to, forming a joint venture with the St Kilda Cricket Club and sharing those facilities evenly. The players loved the intimacy of the ground, the fans loved being able to have space and not have to piss on exterior walls at half-time. It was great. Now, I keep calling it the Junction Oval, but it wasn't actually called that until Fitzroy moved in. Anyway, Junction Oval would be their new home for 1970, and look who's back to celebrate the reopening. St Kilda had somewhat fallen off since their flag had lost Ian Stewart, and Fitzroy had just beaten last year's premiers in front of the damn Queen, and of course St Kilda scored 9 goals in the first quarter and... What? Oh, God. Fitzroy only scored 7 for the entire game, with Barry Breen and both Pascoes getting 4 to lead the Saints to, at the time, their biggest score and biggest ever win. They're the only side to this day to achieve that feat at a former home ground as the away side. The Roys would manage their first home win at the venue against a shithouse North Melbourne who kicked 5 goals 24. Jesus. The year, though, was a wash, climbing up just the one spot from 69, completing a climb from terrible to merely quite bad. I'm going to spoil it for you that no games of any relevance are played at Junction Oval by Fitzroy until 1979, with perhaps one exception in 1971 that saw Fitzroy knock Carlton out of the finals race in the final couple of weeks in a game that was so foggy that no one is even really sure that the game took place in the first place, so it doesn't really count in my book.
Oh yeah, and like I said, they became the only footy team to win in front of the royal family, and no, I'm not counting West Coast winning for Prince Harry. A couple of the lads have funny stories. Alan Thompson kept his head bowed the whole time. Norm Brown forgot his own players' names. John Murphy tells how the boys all had to put fresh kit in their falsies in. And Alex Ruskuklich, or however you say that, ended up being a cheeky bastard to Prince Charles. Top work. It wasn't the only big game that Fitzroy played. They were in the first VFL fixture to ever be played on a Sunday, Harvey Merrigan leading the side to a 20-point win over Richmond at the G to kick off 1970. They also played the first ever match at Waverley Park 2 weeks later, going down big time against Geelong. Despite that, they just weren't a big side anymore. 1972 would see an average home attendance of 17,287, the highest mark not just since leaving Brunswick Street, but since 1961. This encouraging sign faded fast. Attendances dropped by 24% the next season, and the Roys would only ever break that 1972 mark 3 more times across the rest of their existence. However, the 70s would unearth some fantastic players and unique gems that would see the club worm their way into the hearts of fans across the league. Let's start with John Murphy. Already established in the side, he took the mantle of lead ball getter as Murray moved into his 30s. In fact, since stats got recorded in 1965, no man got more kicks in a season for the Roys than 1971 John Murphy. Except John Murphy, and John Murphy. Shout out to the man in 5th, by the way. His name is John Murphy. The first of only 2 Roys to break the 600 touch barrier, injury sadly robbed us of his next 2 years after hitting that mark. As it was, a career average of 24.6 touches and 1.5 goals per game with 111 Brownlow votes, well, that's an amazing career, even without captaining his side for 6 years. He eventually got shipped off to South, but sadly his career fell apart from there. He retired at North in 1980. He was amazing. Amazing doesn't quite describe the career of Renato Serafini. Debuting in that Fog game, he and his brother Laurie both played for a while, but Renato never hit the high expectations that were placed upon them. Both began as full forwards, Renato winning a leading goal kicker prize at the club and Laurie scoring 4 on debut, but 5 over his next 145 as he became a pivotal figure in defence. Renato remains a cult figure, whilst Laurie's greatest contributions for the club came after it died, helping bring in Lee Matthews as the coach in his role as director in the late 1990s, but we will get there. Warwick Irwin was a typical Fitzroy guy, unusual in his build and indeed his coiffed hair, but dedicated to his craft, courageous to a fault and entertaining in the extreme despite being erratic. Look at his 1971 for example, he kicked 15 goals, 42. But 451 touches and nearly 100 marks meant that in this, his first full season, he dragged the Roys to a winning record for the first time in 10 years. He won the Best and Fairest in 1975 and was a fan favourite, but the Roys, desperate for cash, sold him for 6 figures to a Pies side fans don't think he wanted to be a part of. When the Pies beat a spirited Roys by a point, with Irwin having scored a goal for the Black and Whites that day, his heart fell through the floor. He returned to Fitzroy for a bit at the end, and despite the accidental heartbreak he'd caused the Lions, they welcomed him back into the family because, well, that was basically what he was. The next year was the breakout for another star and a good mate of Irwin's, Gary Wilson. Like Irwin, his first season was benign. His second, though, wow. He led the club goal kicking with only Murphy getting more of the ball. He took home the Best and Fairest as well, the first of 5 the diminutive rover would take home. His silky skills, extreme speed, sublime finishing and fiery bravery belied a frame that began VFL life at only 65 kilograms and saw him noticed by the umpires more than most, averaging 3 votes every 4 games in his prime and .62 per game overall. That prime saw him finish 2 votes from the top in 1978 and second by a single vote the next year. A lot of people say he was robbed. This run included 3 showings of 42 touches or more, leading him to 690 touches in 1979, the most of any Fitzroy player in a season, beating the record of, well, Gary Wilson. Only one other player got within 80 touches of that 690 mark. You can guess who it was. It was Gary Wilson. He was brilliant. Just ask Kevin Murray, who describes him as the finest player he ever shared the field with. Fitzroy was slightly fortunate to have him in the first place as he'd grown up in South Melbourne zone. After a juniors game where he'd kicked a lazy 15 snags, he went up to a higher up at South and said, "Sign me up," as his parents were about to move to Preston. The problem was, he was 9, so obviously he was turned down. Cut to some years later and Wilson fails to make the cut for the Roys under-19s. He turns up the train anyway and makes the final squad, has to wait for a month and a half to start, but wins the Best and Fairest even despite that. They couldn't put him in the seniors fast enough after that happened. He became a fan favourite, and at Fitzroy there's 2 ways of becoming a fan favourite. Kick a bunch of goals, which Gary kind of did, but not as much as other guys, or put your absolute heart into everything you did on the field. And the man they called the Flea absolutely did. And that became a problem. He threw himself into contests so much that he claims at least 5 knockouts and 20 concussions over his career. Now, luckily he was teammates with Chris Smith, who claims to be the first person to wear a helmet in the VFL. I can't find proof, but he predates Phil Narkle by 8 years because of multiple concussions of his own. Fun fact, Gary even wore it whilst listening to the 1980 Brownlow count on the radio, a count he happened to lead for a very brief period late in the season. And let's talk about Gary and the Brownlow, because what the hell, this video's not getting any shorter. It's 1978. Gary has won the Best Player award from The Age, and the Sporting Globe, and the Sunday Press, and the Herald, and the Truth, and the Sun, and Inside Football, and the Observer. He was the favourite for the Brownlow, which is weird because everyone knew a different bloke had won it before a vote had even been read out. 1979 was a similar year, not as dominant in media awards, but this was peak Wilson. He ended up losing out by a single vote to a ruckman who could hardly kick a ball, and although he'd lead in 1980, he wouldn't really come close to the win. Now, back to that helmet. Smith bought one for Gary among a fleet of other Fitzroy halfbacks in an effort to continue Flea's career as his numbers dipped when years started to contain 80s. And these things weren't the Daniel or Jerry numbers you see today. This was actually an off-the-rack bicycle helmet. Different times. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to make much of a difference for young Gary. As he quit his clerking job to become fully professional, he took up swimming and tried as hard as he could to condition his body. It didn't help much though. He started young and so he only lasted until he was 31, still playing 23 games in that final season. He simply said that he didn't want to stay on past that if he wasn't good enough to play on the ball anymore. He played 268 games and nearly 300 if you count Victorian and Night Series games. Lee Carlson said he could have gone for another 4 years. Going by his 1984 numbers, I believe him. Only 2 men played more and kicked more goals for the Roys than the fiercely loyal Gary Wilson. The Flea had a chance to flee. At the end of 79, he was offered out by the club as it began to feel the financial pinch. He had talks with Ron Joseph at North, but Gary's desire to be captain of Fitzroy far outweighed the slight pay bump and occasional wins that North were offering. Now, someone talked to old Flea, and he said that there was a turning point that came in 1978. The 20th of June, it's the final of the Night Series Cup. The reigning Premier Kangaroos stand ready to crush yet another opponent. As loyal GAZ-man viewers may remember, this is perhaps the most powerful this club has ever been, even to this day, especially considering the most recent squads they put out. 5 years ago, they were nothing. Then Ron Barassi came along, as did a whole bunch of superstars, and then they found some of their own. The only side that's remotely given them a scare in this comp is the last place Saints, but every other side has been comfortably dispatched. Meanwhile, Fitzroy are still a bit of a joke. Unlike their opponents, they will not make a grand final this year. They haven't made a grand final since 1944. They will finish 9th. They only beat Tasmania, a glorified district side, by 3 goals in this tournament. No one really knows who they are or what they're about, and no one is really all that frightened of them when the Roos score twice on them in the first 4 minutes of the final. The Roys then not only managed to level it up, but score the only goal of a bitter second term to lead by 6 at the half. David McMahon, doing his best Neo impression, provides an assist to Warwick Irwin that starts an onslaught. After many entries for little reward, Bob Beecroft presents and kicks his first. From the bounce, a special mystery player that I'll reveal to you in a little bit, well, he super boots it from the edge of the centre square and it carries over the last man. I've got that pegged at about 60 metres. Fair effort, but it's nowhere near his best, but we will get to him. Fitzroy again clear the centre bounce, North offer token resistance, but Wilson and McMahon link up with David getting his second on Goliath. Fitzroy even do all of North's scoring for the term, Chris Hansen diving over the goal line with the pill uncontested. Beecroft presents again with a nice mark, scoring from range. It's incredible. They've scored 33 points to 1 this term, and they're not even close to done. Again, the Roys chip in with a streak of behinds on a damp and muddy deck, broken by Alan Thompson's only goal all year. Irwin gets the centre clearance, and I don't know what Darryl Sutton's doing here, but it sure ain't defending Bob Beecroft, who gobbles up the easiest mark and goal of his night and maybe his career. A behind before the siren sees a 50-1 term come to an end, along with any semblance of the match being competitive. North would score a whole 2 points in the last. They'd only had one worse half to that point in their existence, despite being absolute garbage for about 50 of their 54 years in the VFL. Irwin, McCarthy and Mick Quinlan add further daggers to the pure delight of 26,000 fans, of which Lou Richards would be shocked to find a single Kangaroos fan. The Roys win by 76, the biggest win of the tournament. This is the first success for the Roys senior team in 19 years, but even that Night Series Cup of 1959 was only inclusive of that year's non-finalists. This was their first prize that meant anything since 1944, and despite this cup win serving as a catalyst for vastly increased competitiveness that would see them become a finals regular over the next decade, it would be their last actual trophy.
Not that they knew or cared at the time. They delayed the presentation ceremony by running a victory lap with the fans who'd driven all the way out east on a soggy, sodden Wednesday night to watch a side that had won more games in this tournament than the actual 1978 VFL season so far take on the reigning premiers, a side that had made 5 grand finals in the last 4 seasons. And look, yes, only the little loser teams care about this cup, hence why Essendon, Collingwood, Carlton, Melbourne and Geelong combined for only 2 wins of this competition to that point. But after all this suffering, being in a match of any significance meant so much. Look at all these people who came here surely expecting to get absolutely destroyed in the Melburnian winter at the most miserable ground on the planet on a school night. This means so much to them and to the 20 men they're parading with. Nope, parading for. Let's just revel in these scenes for a little bit longer. After all, we'll never see them again. Here's Coach Graham Campbell, a former Lion best and fairest who played on that day in 1959, as such becoming the only man directly involved in both cup wins. Here's Ron Alexander, who would eventually become a best and fairest in his final Roy season, in a season where a fellow Roy won the Brownlow. On the other side of Wilson is Harvey Merrigan, a best and fairest fullback and current skipper. Here's Rod Carter, who's most notable for kicking only 1 goal in 293 games as a staunch fullback. Peter Keys was recognised for his efforts in keeping North goalless for 97 timed minutes of play, with $100 and a car he didn't even get to keep long enough to play his old side a fortnight later. And here's the song. They sung it so loud the roving reporter couldn't even hear the boys in the field.
I wonder if Jack's ready for us yet. We can hear them in the background, all they're singing.
Well, I'm trying to get hold of it, Graham.
Gary Wilson, in his captain's speech, says the cup will spark the Roys to greatness. We'll win the next 11 in a row, he says. Now, of course, they didn't. They won 2 before a Swans reality check, but stabilised to win 8 games, finish 9th, and built the sort of foundations necessary to go on a finals run. Now, there were a couple of new names that came into the squad around this time that really changed the complexion of the side and helped fulfil Wilson's dream. The first was Mickey Quinlan, a forward flanker with pace and physicality in equal measure. They dubbed him the Sherman because he'd bust through anything and keep running on. While his best work would be in the 1980s, he had some fine performances in this, his sophomore year. Robert Walls had also, of course, joined from Carlton in 1978, a premiership hero and indeed the only flag winner on the list. He provided valuable experience to the side that really helped them push forward. He won a TV for his efforts as best on ground in the 1978 Night Series final and noted that the club atmosphere was really welcoming to transfers like him.
Yeah, they'd accepted us so well and made us feel at home, and we feel as if we've been at Fitzroy for years. And
God, he sounds exactly the same as he would when he was on that TV 30 years later. He was great too. Rest easy, King. The addition of Walls would prove to be a pivotal move, as in a couple of years he would begin his coaching career with the Roys, seamlessly replacing the iconic Bill Stephen, who'd come in again for I think the 3rd spell at coaching at this rate. Then there was the big addition. You know, the mystery man from earlier who bombed a 60-metre goal without a sweat, the one who was synonymous with 1980s Fitzroy, who you probably know already if you're a footy nerd, and I'm hiding his identity for now because he doesn't really do anything huge for another couple of years, but he helped give shape to the forward line from this point on. You probably already know who he is, but you'll meet him for real soon. Don't worry. In fact, let's put up a timer if you're so anxious. Fitzroy were on the up then, headed into 1979, but their first opponent was already on top, being a Collingwood side that would come exactly 1 Wayne Harms away from the premiership 6 months later. Worse, this match was at Victoria Park, the scariest fortress in the league and the Lions' very worst ground to play at. Fitzroy won by 80 points. This isn't a good team being caught unawares at the start of a season. This is a demolition against a side that would score 200 points in 3 weeks' time. The Roys then struggled for a few weeks and then bang, out of nowhere they meet an Essendon side with a percentage of 110 and score 25 goals on them. Fitzroy's highest score was achieved twice before this point, 25-29, 179, in terminal cases of inaccuracy.
This was only the third time the Lions had scored a quarter century of 6-pointers, but a late bomber rally prevented the margin from ticking over 3 figures. The next week, in one of the great shootouts, Fitzroy scored 163 to creep over the line against a weak Melbourne. They would hold the Hawks to a 0-goal 14 first half, then dunk almost 150 points on reigning premiers North. A flurry of somewhat normal wins, including beating the Pies again, put the Lions in second, setting up a top-of-the-table clash against the powerhouse of Carlton, which was over at half-time. A high-scoring loss to Richmond and a hard win over Essendon left the Roys third, and then Melbourne came around again. Hey, sorry to jump startle you, just popping in to shill the Patreon. The Patreon members of this channel have had exclusive access to the released parts of this documentary for 2 months now, and will get early and ad-free access to all videos I create. As soon as they are finished, they go straight on the Patreon, so no need to wait for videos. So come join if that's your bag. Now back to the video. It was hard to know what to expect from the Demons. They'd been belted by Carlton and scored 24 goals in a game all across the last 2 weeks. But largely, they were crap. Their country zone was starting to show just how poor it was, and the lineup they'd named today, missing captain coach Carl Dietrich, star wingman Robbie Flower, and the explosive Phil Carman, had just over half the total experience of this up-and-coming Roy side. Hell, Greg Wells was one of only 2 Demons to have gone at a goal per game to this point. Fitzroy had 8. A Fitzroy win was likely, probably expected, but no one expected the magnitude of the win that would follow. Melbourne scored 6-12-48 for the match. That's already not good, especially for the 80s. Worse for them, Fitzroy scored 1 point more than that in each of the first 2 quarters, leading 14-14 to 2-5 at the half. Then the third term began. Melbourne scored 2 goals 3, almost doubling their score. A Herculean effort for sure, made moot by the Roys. To this point, they'd been very impressive. They were never super high scorers. The last time they'd scored 98 points in a half was in 1961. The time before that was 29 years ago. They'd only twice held a 70-point margin at the half before, once 20 years ago, and the other time was during World War I. And yet, that was nothing compared to their third term. Of the 2,928 quarters of VFL-AFL football played at Waverley Park, no one team has scored more in a single quarter than Fitzroy's 12-3-75, pushing the margin out to an unthinkable 141 points. Fitzroy had only twice gotten within 40 points of this mark. Both were in the closing stages of world wars. 2 minutes after the resumption of play, who else but Gary Wilson slotted a goal to mark Fitzroy's record score. They then scored another 3 goals within the next 3 minutes as the gaffer pushed all the buttons he could, going all in his own words, to try and claim the record for highest score and maybe margin as well. Those records? Well, the Pies had the record win, 178, against, St Kilda, naturally, earlier that year. Amazingly, Footscray had set the record score of 213 right the hell after losing a future Brownlow and 2-time Coleman winner, again against St Kilda because they were arse salad back then, even by St Kilda standards. 5 minutes into the last, the Roys were on about 198, leading by a solid 160 or so. Well within range, but not necessarily guaranteed of taking both of these records. Harvey Merrigan, the only 1970s best and fairest we haven't really talked about, and a man with only 12 goals to his credit in his career, then made history in the 21st minute by slotting goal 33, moving the Roys to 218 points. 1 record down, 1 to go. Let's talk about someone special who helped the Roys get record number 2, because he doesn't get enough love. Stat chat, guys, if you're watching, here's a challenge. Name every player to hit 300 senior games and 600 senior goals. I'll give you some thinking time. That was it. Here they are. The VFL-AFL, of course, represents an outsized portion, mainly because their record keeping is better and their players tended to last a little bit longer overall. Peter Hudson's Tasmania days get him across the line, while a few SANFL boys join the party, as they should, because that league was equally legitimate until 1990. So too was the WAFL, but many of their big goal kickers fall just short of the game's requirement. One man, though, played across all three leagues for 5 years each. He has numbers comparable to Matty Pavlich, Taylor Walker and Stewie Lowe, and broke Fitzroy's goals in a season record. And yet, Bob Beecroft is a name that you haven't heard before unless you grew up in a very specific time and place in footy. He played his first ever game at 13, and yet 4 years later he was playing with Swan Districts in the WAFL and had no idea of how anything worked, even accidentally entering the ground via the plebs entrance and paying for a ticket to play the damn game. 2 years after that, he was their best and fairest and an All-Australian ruckman. Big for the time at 191 and 92, Beecroft possessed a fantastic leap, brilliant endurance and fine skill for a player of his size. Fitzroy wanted him as early as 1972, but districts forbade Beecroft from leaving for years. Beecroft resented the club and went so far as to pack his family into his car in 1975 and just drove to Melbourne from Perth.
I wanted to get to Melbourne as quick as I could after 1972, just to play in, the best competition. But I did agree to play a couple of years with Swans. They guaranteed that I would be free then to go to Melbourne and play with Fitzroy. But I gave them 2 very good years, and when I went in to see the general manager and remind him of our agreement, he completely reneged on it and said, well, no, we're not going to let you go. I was pretty filthy with that. So he said, well, we can keep you out of footy for a year, which they could on those form tours in those days, and I didn't want to miss a year of footy, so the only option I had was to play another year, and even then, after I did that, unlikely that they would even release me then. So, as you said, I had to escape. I got the family together, and I drove to Top the Nullarbor in my Datsun 1600, which I'd won while I was playing with Swan Districts, believe it or not.
And the old 1600 was hardly a Greyhound bus. How was that journey like?
Tell you what, mate, it was bulletproof car.
Experience it yourself at your Nissan Datsun dealer.
There's about 400 miles of absolute crap road, like gravel and potholes and God knows what, and I reckon I hit every one of those and the hell out of the car. But it got us there.
I love this guy. The gambit worked and districts cleared him the night before the season began, but it started shakily. Then Kevin Rose had a brainwave. Put the big man up front. It was a genius move. The first year was shaky, but in each subsequent year, Beecroft led Fitzroy's goal kicking. This was his best year. His 9th and 10th goals not only broke the margin record, but also put him in touch for the Coleman medal, a fight he only lost by 6 goals.
I kicked one towards the end there. Mickey Quinlan was hammering down the wings, and he dodged around a few guys. I got away from my guy and made a pretty clear lead right into the right area and had to scream at him to kick the footy. And don't think he was going to do it, but he did it in the last minute.
After a 63-goal 1980, he moved to Woodville to play and lose extremely often alongside Malcolm Blight, ending a VFL career that was far too short. Our mystery surprise guest got the last goal to make the score 36 goals 20, 238 to 6-12-48. Only one team, 1992 Geelong, would score more point. And I mean point. They beat it by only one before quarters were shortened to 20 minutes in 1994. Incidentally, Robert Walls, centre-half forward and future Roy's coach on that day in 1979, would be the coach of the losing Brisbane Bears side on that 1992 day and lamented his choice not to flood men back, as that record score at that point was really all the Roys had. The modern equivalent of that score, adjusting per live minute, is 190 points. A few teams have since broken this, but not many, and of course, Mark Thompson era Geelong just fucking took that record and belted it outside the woodshed if you adjust it to points per minute. As for the 190 point margin, it remains a record with an asterisk. Again, 2011 Geelong, in a match GAZ-man stands should be familiar with, won their match by 186 with 20% less time to deal with. A 152 point margin is the modern equivalent, which has happened 5 times. So that shows you what an effort the Roys had to produce to get to that mark. It was their masterpiece.
That was one game where everyone played at their absolute level. And when that happens, you're virtually unbeatable. And it happened all over the ground, and the momentum was built and built and built. And you could see Melbourne just get more and more demoralised as the day wore on. Also, Harvey Merrigan probably got down there and kicked a goal from his full-back position as well. It was just they're unstoppable, you know.
But they'd spent pretty much all they had then and there. They belted the Dons in the opening week of the finals to the tune of 81 points, which disguised the poor run of form they'd had immediately after that Melbourne thrashing, and then Collingwood took revenge in the semi for what the Lions had done to them in the regular rounds, erasing a minor Fitzroy half-time lead by booting 48 points to 10 in the third term alone.
There was a critical moment in that game where Leon Harris ran into goal and booted the goal, which we had huge momentum, and I think it would have put us in front or very close to it. I was right there, and the umpire pinged him for running too far. He wouldn't have run 10 metres. I wouldn't have thought anyway. And he certainly didn't run too far. It's while we were going off, a rocker at the umpire, they just grabbed the ball and took it from one end to the other and kicked a goal. That absolutely deflated the whole side. And I think we went down by 17 points in the end, but it was we had the momentum to take that game, and that incident was a turning point. I'll never forget it.
1979 was over, but the Roys had shown that a new era was dawning at Junction Oval. However, there was a real chance that this era wouldn't be dawning much longer. In 1980, the first French-language performance of Les Miserables was performed. Don't worry, I'm going somewhere with this. The English version, ostensibly a direct translation, didn't come till later but basically shared the same beats and tone. Towards the end of Act 1, Marius finds himself torn between wanting to fight in the June Rebellion with his friends or flee the city to be with his love Cosette, who he's only known for about 3 days, mind. The leader of the group, Enrollas, whose name is, funnily enough, never said in the actual play, and so I'm definitely pronouncing it wrong, attempts in the song Red and Black to measure the loyalties of everyone in his organisation. "It is time for us all to decide who we are," he proclaims. And, indeed, in 1980, Fitzroy finds themselves in a similar situation. Fitzroy win their first 1980 game. They then lose their next 6. A win and a draw consecutively fail to spark a form turnaround, and again they lose their next 6. Their form picks up slightly, but leading into round 22 they are tied with St Kilda for last place. At approximately 3:35 PM on the 30th of August, both sides are down at three-quarter time. The Saints are in a tight wrestle with the North side, whose destiny for next week is already locked in. Fitzroy find themselves in a tougher situation. 51 points down against the Carlton side, who right now find themselves in first in a percentage battle with Geelong that's wavered up and down all day. The gap becomes 52, but is pegged back with an early behind on the run from Mark Azani. Wilson then kicks a goal from the orchestra stalls. I mean, fantastic, but it's big. Chris Paul cuts the gap to 42 with a massive 3 energy, if you know what I mean. Still, he has played an immense game. He'll get 37 and 3 today, which is ridiculous. Carlton answer with a behind, trap it in, and score with Vin Kentoggio's 3rd. 52 is the gap again. It's just done. A rebound from Carlton's goal square that's equal parts arse and class results in a Rod Lewis behind that he never got credited for, funnily enough. Mark Gazzani adds another miss. Fitzroy look absolutely terrible. They have decided who they are. A lucky free to Quinlan ends in a Marquezani goal, but they're still down 44. The next forward entry is Fitzroy's. They apply enough pressure for a forward 50 turnover, but Wilson misses. That mysterious tall number 5 intercepts the kick-in, drills it from Ballarat, but hits the post. Both posts, actually, which is crazy. Leaf out of 2025 Richmond's book, that. A book covered in feces, no doubt. Stoic defence continues to generate chances, and David McMahon gets a long-range goal. 18 minutes gone, 36 points still the gap. Make that 35 as McMahon receives the centre clearance, but his aim was off. It's trapped in and Marquezani dusts up nicely, scoring his 3rd goal, and now they have proper momentum. They clear the next centre bounce, a throw in next to the point post. Marquezani wins a free close in, and 23 is now the gap. Carlton clear the bounce, but Neville Taylor gets the Lions out of a jam. The ball is promoted forward, Mick Conlon snares it, and at full tilt kicks a fine and trademark goal. The Princes Park crowd gets noticeably more nervous, especially as Warwick Owen clears the next centre bounce. McMahon marks it and kicks his 4th goal. 11 points is the gap, and suddenly the Roys look capable of winning. Carlton get the clearance through McKay, but that Fitzroy defence, despite allowing 10 goals 6 in the previous quarter, is now shutting up shop. Everett clears, finds the little champion Wilson, it bounces around, little David Rankin in his 6th of only 9 league games chips it up and finds that mystery guess. I promise I'll properly reveal him soon, look at the timer, but for now, our man kicks truly and narrows the gap to 5. Despite quick ball movement and great defence, the Roys are still facing the last true Carlton juggernaut. McKay, the most experienced man on the ground, uses that experience to break free and convert. Frank Marquezani, though, well, he won't have that. The Lions clear the ball, Frank receives it on a flank. The callers think it's in, except for the goal umpire, who correctly calls it behind. The Roys get it back though, and Mick Conlon marks. Scoring goal number 3 for him, he makes history as this is the only game ever in BFL-AFL history where both sides have scored 20 goals and 20 behinds. The momentum is still theirs, and there's enough time for a clearance and a mark. The Roys get the clearance, the ball sailing up into the forward zone. At this point in time, the biggest comeback at 3/4 time is 44 points. Comebacks this late are rare though. That match was in 1947. Only 8 comebacks of even 36 points or more at the final change have been recorded in the VFL, the last of which was in 1962. The Roys were 51 down and have had 8 missed chances besides. This would have smashed all known expectations of football and remained a record today, but the siren goes while the floated kick hovers in the air. St Kilda managed to come back from their piddling deficit to draw, meaning that despite the 5th best final term in their history to that point, Fitzroy would finish last for 1980. This was the Fitzroy experience now. Pain for so long, then a whirlwind display of not just competence, but brilliance, giving you just enough hope to not entirely give up, only to let you down right at the end. Cycle anew, ad infinitum. Well, not infinitum as it turns out, but we'll get there.
Foreshadowing isn't.
You already said that! Who proofreads your scripts?
You see, unbeknownst to them, Melbourne is about to turn into a giant metaphorical war zone. As the 1980s progress, clubs will increasingly feel the effects of the giant spending war they've engaged in for the last 3 decades. Many of them are literal neighbours, and the streets that divide them have grown walls in the past decades. 7 of these clubs will be classed as insolvent at one point.
So we knew that there was a bit of drive financially. We didn't think it was as serious as it panned out to be, but we knew it was a problem. Not that big a problem, so I need to get rid of clubs out of Melbourne. We all knew that. Every player from every club knew that.
But luckily, one of these clubs will receive a golden ticket to paradise. The VFL has just finished a feasibility study headed by, among others, former Saints boss Graham Huggins concerning setting up a VFL team in Sydney. They estimate that even cracking a small percentage of the massive market will see a team in rude financial health, and Fitzroy wants in. Mick Quinlan actually recalled that the VFL president, an all-round smart dude in Alan Ayler, approached him personally to garner support for Fitzroy to move to Sydney in 1979. Yes, they've been performing very well very recently, but years in the doldrums and a poor country zone have meant little success, little in the way of sponsorship, and a pretty meagre membership base. In fact, they were basically bankrupt, $300,000 in debt, unable to pay the ATO, which is generally considered not good unless you're, a corporation. Being a corporation would be great, actually, because that would mean that Fitzroy could just move to Sydney and get rid of all their debts without anyone's approval. And the good news is they became a corporation in the early 80s. The bad news, that was 1981. It's 1980 now, and for now they'd have to summon all of their member base to meet up for extraordinary meetings at Fitzroy Town Hall, although I reckon they could have been held in a Honda Civic. The choice was simple. Move to Sydney, keeping the club alive at the cost of its very essence and identity, or stay and fight in the overcrowded Melbourne battleground with no means of defence except a grim determination. Red, a world about to dawn. Black, the night that ends at last. And sorry, I swear that's the last Les Mis reference. The members voted the move down, and a fundraising campaign at the end of the season saw the board decide definitively that the Fitzroy Football Club would stay put. In 1981, South Melbourne were the ones that sold their souls to Sydney, finishing well below a finals-bound Fitzroy. It looked like the Lions made the right call at the time. 40 years later, the Swans made their 7th grand final appearance in that time frame. Fitzroy, well, again, we'll get to that.
Foreshadowing.
At the end of 1980, another problem arose. Young star Frank Marcazzani had played 16 games that year, but wanted to play for the mighty Carlton side he'd almost beaten in that mighty last term. He stood out of football entirely so as to get that clearance, and I tell you, the Roy season may well have ended later if he was in that side, and was eventually traded for Peter Francis as well as a cash incentive. Both players were serviceable, though never really amounted to much at their new homes. And Frank wasn't the only one to depart. The Lions, in one disastrous off-season, lost Irwin, Allen, Walls, Richardson, Higgins, and, most damaging of all, Bob Beecroft, who of course moved to Adelaide to eventually join Malcolm Blight in a Woodville team that, despite its own talent, was rapidly dying.
And the fact that all I ever wanted was just a reasonable job with a bit of future, and it never happened. It stopped at jobs and sat down at the end of the 80 season and thought, well, I'd love to stay and play here, but I need to make a clean break. I need to get myself a decent job for the future. I need to be paid on time for my efforts on the ground. I don't need the stress of any of those issues anymore in my life. And Robbie Walls tried to talk me into staying, and I'd made my mind up, and as far as life goes, it panned out pretty well for me.
Fitzroy had lost a 70-goal forward. Luckily, they already had another one on their list. I would like to finally announce and welcome our surprise mystery guest. The Footscray Bulldogs were struggling financially about as much as Fitzroy were. Forced to sell players just to make ends meet, they'd have to shift one of their veterans for 70 grand, which really wasn't much. A cult figure at Whitten Oval, this forward went at just over a goal per game. He was mainly used as a bit of a link-up man, think like a Tom Lynch kind of operator. And before you ask, the good Tom Lynch. Yes, that one. Yes, based. He'd never really threatened to even be the leading goal kicker at his own club, not while Kevin Templeton was king of Footscray, so the 28-year-old centre-half forward was seen as expendable. In an age where the full forward ruled all, a long-kicking man based high up the ground was a bit of a novelty, and he remained so until Beecroft made a beeline for Adelaide. Now, Bernie Quinlan was about to show his super boot to everyone.
Bernie Quinlan was a magnificent athlete, and he was one of the best kicks you'd ever see. He had all the skills. It's a little bit different type of player from Malcolm, but right up there. Well, great Malcolm Blight is the best footballer I've seen, and close behind Bernie Quinlan and Keith Gregg, Jezelenko.
Bernie was good at the Dogs, great even, but once he arrived at the Lions, he set about becoming an entirely different beast. Gary Wilson relates that as soon as he arrived at the Junction, he beefed up huge, which suited the new role he was about to take on. Quinlan had only kicked multiple bags of over 4 goals in a season once, back in 1975. He did it twice in the first month of 1981, and 16 goals over the next month saw Quinlan for the first time in his life in the Coleman medal race, and what a race it was. First you have Michael Roach, who'd scored 112 goals the previous year at over 72% accuracy, who'd quickly become the best forward in the VFL. Then you had the Macedonian marvel himself, a young Peter Dacos who would soon establish himself as one of the most mercurial players in VFL history and yet might not even be the best player in his damn family. And as if that wasn't enough competition, one Mark Jackson was hovering around when he wasn't setting people on fire or attempting to actually manslaughter one of the most beloved players of all time. Oh, and then you had Malcolm Blight, who was still at North for now, but he was so OP that he had to be nerfed in a mid-season patch, and by that I mean he was injured. These guys seesawed all year, but a 21 goal in 3 weeks span from Roach near the end gapped his rivals by enough to comfortably win. Quinlan, well, he'd have to console himself by just winning the Brownlow medal, and wait.
What?
Yeah, a centre-half forward became the last Fitzroy player to ever win the Brownlow medal, because look at those disposal numbers. Bernie was still doing his link-up work, but also finishing a lot more chances. Quinlan got as much of the ball as Gerard Healy, and more than Ross Glendinning. The only man to take more marks was Barry Round, who in a startling coincidence was also a former Bulldog, and also won the Brownlow medal. Don't worry, Bulldogs fans, you will get your revenge. Funnily enough, the VFL dropped the tie-break procedure for the medal that year, so Quinlan and Round were the first tied pair to both walk away with the medal since 1939. And Bernie deserved it. He was a freak. Even discounting his before-his-time linkman role, he could just wheel and go himself from uber long range. He moved incredibly well for a big fella, even at the age of 30, and even by this point, his reputation preceded him. Some of the Roys were getting starstruck just kicking it to him. What's a superstar like that doing here, they seem to ask. So typically, when you win a Brownlow, your team does well. Well, in most cases anyway. And so it was with the 1981 Roys. It's finals time. Who we got? Ah, shit. Now, Fitzroy entered the finals with a percentage of 112, the worst of that season, of the finalists anyway. Now, while in the league's old days it was common for all finalists to have percentages exceeding 120 as the midpoint of the league didn't correlate to the amount of finals tickets that got handed out, things had normalised recently with the advent of a 5-team finals series. Fitzroy's 112.1 was good enough to not be last in all but 2 of the 19 top 5 final series that were held. However, thanks to a Melbourne side that came 1 point away from taking 1964 Fitzroy's unwanted record as the last winless side, thanks Footscray, the Roys sat as the worst finalist and had got there on last day results. They, well, didn't play like it though. Despite possessing the leakiest defence that had made it to September, they held Essendon goalless in the first, which opened up enough of a gap to survive a late charge, holding off the Bombers by 15. They then had to face a real test. Collingwood, in a match that would see 85,000 people show up to a Fitzroy game for the second and final time. That Pies side was imperious. They'd made 4 grand finals across the last 4 years, never mind what happened last year. And by the game's halfway mark, they were showing just how much of an anomaly that game was. When Kevin Worthington converts his only touch for the day into a goal, the Pies lead 86-41. But the Roys begin to kick into gear. McMahon gets one from a tight angle and only a minute later pounces on a Collingwood error from a kick-in to add another. Inspired, the Roys have chances that go wide, including this poster from the Superboot himself, but Ray Shaw's chance doesn't. Matt Rendell finally cuts a spell of 7 consecutive behinds with a shot from seemingly the only place the Lions couldn't miss from. He pops up again. Rendell would immediately become the Lions' ruckman of the 1980s from next season, but with Ron Alexander taking up rucking duty for the final time today, he'd hold up at full forward to great effect, with this his 4th goal and 44th for the year. Brewer scores up the other end, which dampened things a bit, but Murnane wins a free for the Roys and he scores, while Quinlan finally gets off his arse and scores his first. Good job. But the gap at the break is still 14. Rendell kicks off the final term with a major, 9 points now. McMahon catches our old mate Rene Kink holding the ball, but his shot falls short. It finds Wilson, who hurts himself but marks and still gets a goal. 3 points to gap now, and the G is rocking. Shaw finds himself loose. Oops. They press but waste chances before little Lee Murnane turns half the population of Smith Street inside out to reduce the gap to 5. Wilson loads up an entry, finding Quinlan and the other half of Smith Street. It's palmed down, but only as far as McMahon, and fittingly the man who started the fight back from 45 points down now kicks the goal that advances Fitzroy into a 1-point lead. And then, even more fittingly, McMahon extends that lead to 7 with his 4th goal. God, he loves these weird matches at the end of seasons. 40 minutes ago, the Lions were dead and gone. Now they've got all the momentum and are riding it home. Their biggest halftime comeback to this point in history was 33. They were down by 38 today. A Wilson miss extends the gap to 8. Unfortunately, because we can't have nice things, Collingwood rebound it down the ground. Nev Taylor drops a mark next to Peter Dacos, and that's just going to lead to bad times. Gap's down to 2. Fittingly, as this was happening, David McMahon has exited the game, benched with an injury. There's no way that Fitzroy will win now. Their talisman's gone and... oh, okay. Maybe we'll be alright. And I've got to stop opening my mouth here. Davis scores. The game's turned into a shootout. Grant Laurie, who's played well, kicks his 2nd goal from a halfback flank. Lovely marks to Herbert, and Rendell see only a minor score to the latter and another rushed behind. Now, who was Laurie's man again? Peter Dacos. Right. Here he is. Oh no. Collingwood clear from the bounce. Davis is interfered with. He lobs it to the hot spot. The Lions fail to clear, and Ross Brewer pounces. The lead switches hands again. Murnane gets a clearance, but his inside 50 clears everyone, and Pointer falls with it over the goal line. Worth 4 points in rugby, but only 1 here. This will be the final score. In an absolute thriller, the highest scoring team in the league bows out of September by a single point to a Pies side that probably should have won the flag. Now, had the Roys won this match, had that Murnane kick dribbled through 7 metres to the left, would they have beaten Geelong in the prelim? Well, no, as they were 0-2 against the Cats in 1981, plus they'd shipped 400 points more than any other team that would be left to play. But it would have been interesting to see Fitzroy and Geelong in the prelim final for at least one reason. See, Geelong, for whatever reason, was needlessly paranoid in the protection of their lineup and tactics for the prelim. To ensure that Gary Sidebottom, who lived in a remote town called Lara, didn't obviously join the team, they arranged multiple places where the team bus could pick him up. The plan was to let him know which one, pick him up quickly and whisk him away before anyone could see him. Problem was, no one told Gary, and assuming he wasn't selected, he simply stayed home. Geelong lost, with coach Bill Goggins blaming the loss on the play of his forwards. Might have helped if they'd had St Kilda's leading scorer from 1979 on the park, Bill. Nice going. Geelong brass said that not only was Gary not to blame, but that he would be with the club in 1982. So, here's Gary playing for Fitzroy in 1982. Sidebottom was known for being a bit of a loose cannon, and Geelong had suspended him for his attitude early in the year. Mid-season, he was cast out and crossed to Fitzroy, and Robert Walls immediately got the most out of his mare. He went up against his old teammates and crushed them. Goggin resigned at the end of the season, while Sidebottom went on to appear in the mighty WA state sides of the mid-1980s. But despite that, 1982 seemed to be the year that the personnel losses really caught up to the Lions. This was the seed, however, from which the tree was to grow, and it grew instantly thanks to the players they'd added that season getting valuable early game time. Let's introduce you to them. You've met Gary, of course. Here's Brad Gotch, the shortest man in the league at 166 centimetres. He never did a whole lot, but he was handy. Ended up at the Saints, where typically his best career display was against the Lions. Oh yeah, speaking of people you've met before, GAZ-man fans might be familiar with Richard Osborne, the only man to die on an AFL field but lived to tell the tale. You'll hear a lot more of his name in the next few years. And then we have the big two, the pillars of the Fitzroy defence for a decade, the twin young stars that were, at the time, heralded as not just the future of the club, but its saviours. Gary Pert and Paul Roos. Pert was big even as a young man, and I mean young. He was the last of Fitzroy's many 16-year-old debutants, but possessed deceptive speed. Roos's speed, on the other hand, was far from deceptive. He was intangible. Built like a big man, he moved like a small man. Primarily a key defender, he still scored a goal a game in his time at the Lions. The guy got 16 Brownlow votes in consecutive seasons as a key back. What the hell? So, with players like that having time to bed in for 1982, you can see why 1983 might be an exciting year. It's just unfortunate that Bernie Quinlan's hit his ceiling. Old Superboot only got 53 goals last year. That 1981 effort really just looks like an outlier now, and as he drifts further into his 30s, the lack of a high-scoring key forward could hurt the Lions. Anyway, round one. Who we got? Hawthorn. Crap. Still, brave efforts by ruckman Matt Randell, who's going to have his best year this year, and stalwart David McMahon, who very much won't, help keep it close. Huh? Bernie got 5, you say? Must have been in garbage time or something. He'll have a real challenge against North and their brick wall down back in David Dench. Huh. Dench isn't playing, you say? Well, okay. Go nuts, Bernie. Bernie outscores North all on his own. And buddy, the ride is just getting started. 10 against the hopeless Saints, 8 against Melbourne, and 9 in the return match against the Hawks. Just over halfway through the season, things are looking incredible. The Roys have only lost 3 games and 1 against teams not named bloody Hawthorn. And look, in an ordinary story, this is where I build suspense and lead you through the season and say things like the best is yet to come and this isn't even peak Fitzroy, but look, I think throughout the series we've built a fair amount of respect for each other here, too much for me to try and con you. I've spoiled this before. I've told you about the merger more than a few times. I've shown you how this ends. I've told you that no more successes will land in Fitzroy's hands. There's about to be some really, really sad times coming for the club, like really, really soon. And this season will be the final attempt at glory, which will fail. It will produce nothing tangible, no prizes, no glory. There will be 2 major highs, the highest this club will ever get for the rest of their lives in this league. I hate to tell you, one of them comes in round 21, and the other comes in round 13. So, let's start with that one. This is a book by Pete Carter. I mentioned this because I told him what this was for, but I got this thing like 2 years ago, so I'm so sorry, Pete, that it took me this long. Hope you're watching. Anyway, this lists his top 100 wins in Fitzroy's existence, and without wishing to spoil, because I'd recommend this book if you're looking to go over the history of Fitzroy, number 1 isn't a grand final, or indeed any final. It's not a closely fought win, or the first win, or even the last win. Now, remember that Kangaroos game where Bernie outscored the Roos 7 goals to 6? Well, the Roos are back, and I've got to stress, this is a very, very good Roos team. They're also 9-3 with a significant percentage gap. Blight's gone, yes, back to Woodville, but there's still a myriad of very good names in this team. Their last 6 wins were by an average of 10 goals, and they just blasted last year's premiers by 100 damn points. Well, Fitzroy did not care for any of that. With 10 minutes gone, the Fitzroy Lions had a 32-0 lead. This stagnated as the sides went tit for tat for the rest of the half, the gap at the big break being 35. Then, well, the Lions just skipped away. Gary Dempsey was the big power of the day, the star ruckman who loved to drop a kick behind the play and just dominate aerially. I mean, in the top 10 lists of marks per season, he's up there. He dominates. The solution for this? Well, Matt Rendell just went back a kick behind the play with Gary Dempsey. Now, it was an even matchup up front, either 7-on-7 or 6-on-6. Either Quinlan was favourably matched with a one-on-one opponent, or if the big Gary Dempsey was with him, Rendell was left free on the outer. Oh, and plus Mickey Conlon was causing his usual chaos, naturally. Those 3 guys got 22 goals between them. Only the second trio of forwards to all get 7 in the same game, wearing the same colours. And all of this was despite Conlon almost going kickless for the first hour. Crazy. Les Parrish, another 1982 edition, had some schadenfreude, getting 39 touches against North, a team who'd initially rejected him. Meanwhile, the Roos were held to 2 goals in the third, and none in the last. Fitzroy ended up running out 150-point winners, a margin they would never top against anyone in their final 13 years of life in this league, with Rendell celebrating a bag of 8 that broke a 17-game goalless streak by chatting up the sister of one of this series' main sources. And that's very funny, and look, I'd like to just end the season here and say, oh, it didn't work out the way we wanted to, and them's the breaks, and move on. We can't do that, because this season was honestly a real chance for Fitzroy to claim a premiership, albeit an unlikely one. So let's cut to that other moment that I was talking about. Round 21. The Roys are pretty safely ensconced within the top 5. However, there's a chance this could all still go sideways, as a loss to the Bulldogs proves in round 20. They're 8 points clear of 6th. All they need is a win to seal their path to September, and they face that 6th team in round 21. Better still, it's at home. Best of all, it's against the Magpies. The first quarter isn't kind to the Roys, missing chances to trail by a goal at the first break. Fitzroy needs something to spark them. Enter Billy Loken. A former North Adelaide boy, this is the first year in Victoria for the sentiment, and it started slow, but now he's drawn some attention. He does so again here, launching an outrageous punt from just behind exact centre that travels over everyone and only needs 3 bounces, 2 of which were in the goal square, to score and tie the game. A smart snap from Mark Scott and a bread and butter Brad Gotch set shot give Fitzroy a healthy lead. That sentence was so hard, why do I write like this? Gotch then finds Quinlan, who converts from around 50, gets the distance easily, and that's a special goal, his 99th of the season. Logan scores another to really alleviate any sort of pressure in this one. The Pies respond by missing chances all over the place, including this shocker from Wes Fellows. The Roys, as if to punctuate how determined they are this year, sweep the ball all the way down the ground for a goal to young Paul Roos. And from here, Collingwood will get swept away without a trace. It's great. Last home game of the year, bye-bye Collingwood. We're in September, you'll never sing that. Great. But that's not the full story of why this game is so special. Third term, Mark Scott wins a tap that Brad Gotch, our favourite little man, the little fellow, roves to perfection. He snaps and finds him. Capital H. Superboot. 25 metres out on a slight angle, ready to put through goal number 100. Look at the fans. Look at them. They have seen him boot much harder ones than this. They're already over the fence, ready to celebrate. They have seen players from every other club, and I mean every other club, even fucking North Melbourne, even tiny little Footscray, kick 100 goals. Never them. They were the last ones. The last bastion that was being kept out of the 100 club. This was it. But in Fitzroy, both as in sport as is the way in general life for the hard-toiling working class who occupied it, nothing ever comes so easy. The best forward Fitzroy will ever have sprays the easiest shot in the world so badly he doesn't even score. The fans, dejected once more, have to embarrassingly hop over the pickets, hoping that their icon can get himself out of the rut that is his worst performance in front of goal in over a year. Fourth term. Time is running out, and boy, the fans really need this one. Gotch, once again in the game of his life, breaks free. He's all alone. The only men within 20 metres of him are Superboot and fullback Craig Stewart. Normally, here, Stewart would rush to intercept Gotch, who would pop one over the top, bang, goal 100. Not today. Stewart must feel enormous pride, holding the only man who would even top 80 goals and the only forward to top 70 in 1983 to a single major, and any man who does that does not deserve to have the 100 scored on them. He says to Gotch, "Go on, this one's over, you kick your goal, but you're doing it on my terms." Bernie stays on a single major. 18 minutes into the last. Ball up, wing. Rendell monsters fellows in the ruck as he'd done all day. Wilson with lightning quick hands to Gotch with lightning quick feet, and he finds what everyone's been looking for all day. Bernie Quinlan marks the ball on the edge of the centre square. He wastes no time, no set shot routine. Determined to get out of the funk, he just wants to blast the damn pill as hard as he can. So, he does. With a drop punt, no less, he sends the heavy Sharon spinning high in the cold winter sky. It would have landed 10 people deep in the crowd even if they weren't already rushing on from behind the goals, seeing it on target, knowing that because it was the Superboot that kicked it, the distance didn't matter. They poured on with banners, flags, and actual confetti. They broke the picket fence in their desperation to parade around the man who'd finally brought a real, tangible hope for Lions fans. For the first time in many of their lives, they can dare to dream of September glory. And you might be wondering, how did this happen? How did Fitzroy go from no hopers to September regulars on a budget of about $8? Well, this man is the answer. Robert Walls had retired at the end of the 1980 season and immediately took up the coaching role. He had big shoes to fill, replacing our old friend Bill Stephen, an icon at the club, despite holding the record for most games coached without a grand final appearance, until a promising Geelong assistant turned into a circus clown. Walls, of course, had lost a heap of talent from the list on day one, but made up for it with innovation. His first innovation was an emphasis on athleticism, trading the usual long-distance training jogs for a series of sprints that more represented match simulations. His second innovation was the thing he's most known for, but it wasn't even his idea. You may have heard me despair in the past about how kick-ins basically turned into free turnover generators and resulted in the ball flying over the fullback's head within a minute a great deal of the time, as the main tactic was simply booting it as long as possible. Chris Jones, a fitness guru brought in to oversee the sprinting program, well, he noticed this. Jones had played college basketball in the States and wondered if the old basketball pick-and-roll tactic would free up a target better than ploughing it to a 50-50 on the 50. He and Walls took this idea to their backmen, but gave them freedom to experiment and adapt the idea, which took this form. The backmen, knowing their opponents would try and play man coverage because that was the standard, would huddle in a group in the centre of the ground on the 50. Pretty standard. But then one of their many fleet-footed youngsters would suddenly break from the pack, with a couple of the bigger lads setting up blocks to buy him space. The typical variation looked like this, with the receiver usually Les Parrish, but very occasionally the pack would rope a dope, allowing a man to sprint up the middle, receive a long bomb with the flight, unopposed, and have a free avenue to deliver to the full forward. Paul Roos, who was usually that centre runner in this tactic, claimed it was unstoppable, and a lot of coaches agreed. It took until about 1986 for a proper counter to be founded. Walls estimated their kick-in retention rate soared from 50% to as much as 90%. This enhanced their attacks, but was also reliant on the opposition generating specifically chances that missed, spawning the kick-in to begin with. But for the moment, the huddle defense was mystifying opponents and giving those underdogs a much-needed edge. Fitzroy end up third, displaced by the Hawks as the main contenders all announced their credentials with stonking wins. The Lions only finished a win off top, so if they'd, say, dropped the match to, I don't know, a very average Footscray twice, or even a last place St Kilda whose Tony Lockett hadn't fully grown yet, that'd absolutely suck. Wait, they lost to Sydney too? Did they just only lose to Hawthorn and to shit teams? Weird. But then again, Fitzroy's nothing else if not weird. So anyway, regardless of the final Hawks result, they would have played them anyway. Here we go. Oh dear. We're down by 21 points with a term to go. The Roys do have the first chance, but it falls just short and is ushered through by Gary Ayres. After 5 minutes of slow play and turnovers, Quinlan has the second chance, and he too misses. The third time, though, was the charm. Superboot gets some separation from David O'Halloran, who's had a good game but can't do anything about this. Bernie goals and lights a fire under the lines. Straight from the centre bounce, Rendell and I think Les Parrish team up to punch the ball out to side bottom, the man both Geelong in 1981 and the Hawk midfield today in 1983 just left behind. He boots a goal from the border of the centre square to bring the margin down to 7. Game on. Next bounce, ball spills to the wing, Parrish gets a free, he lofts one up and once more Superboot hovers above the pack. He kicks from 8 metres inside the centre square, and if anyone can make this distance, it's not Superboot. Hawthorn take it all the way down the other end, and Peter Knights, in only his second season kicking more than 15 goals, kicks his 6th of the day. Quinlan, though, seeks redemption. He gets it on his chest only a minute after the goal umpire puts his flags down at the other end. He makes the distance this time, his 5th, and the gap is back to 7. Then, something weird happens. In the futuristic cyberpunk dystopia that is 2026, we can see that Michael Nettlefold had demonstrated insufficient intent to keep the ball in play by diving over the line. However, in the 1980s, the phrase insufficient intent hasn't soaked into the mind of the football fan like weed killer into verdant soil and seems to pertain more to disposal of the ball, especially from kick-ins. However, under the rules of law before 2016, this is a perfectly acceptable umpiring call as a deliberate out-of-bounds provision had existed for decades to this point. And tellingly, Nettlefold does not argue the call. Michael Tuck bends the resultant free kick back to extend the gap to 13 again. Rendell, who has dominated in ruck, wins a free and booms it long. The ball spills past the Hawk backman and little Leon Harris snaps on the run, back to 7 points. Here's big Rendell again, taking a fantastic grab back with the flight before selling a dummy. His kick leaves a bit to be desired, but it's a ground ball, and our man Gary Wilson eats those up. He chips a lovely little pass over to the big man, Bernie Quinlan. He's on a tight angle, but he spears the middle. 1 point is in it, and the Roy's fans are going nuts. Schwab gets a free for being poleaxed high, a bit unlucky from the Lions, but he misses. The kick in from Harris, the sun in his eyes, goes straight to Tuck. He converts, and the gap is 8. A fantastic chain of handballs through the guts sees Nettlefold keen to make amends. He pounds one towards the square to Quinlan and his new opponent in Chris Mew, and Bernie is just too strong. He gets his 7th from point-blank range and, along with Knights, becomes the second man this match to kick 4 in a quarter. 2 points is the gap, 21 minutes gone. Parrish tidies up in defence after a probing Hawthorn attack, and Lee Carlson in some majestic long sleeves puts his ass on the line to take a brave grab. He finds McMahon on the flank, he turns and goes for the only target any 1980s Roy wants, but it's a poor kick and goes out of bounds. Contesting this contest for Hawthorn is Chris Mew, a stalwart defender who would go on to be a 5-time premiership-winning Hall of Fame key back. This will be the biggest rucking season of his career, but he's only registered 48 hitouts. He gives away 4 centimetres and a great deal of experience to his opponent, Bernie Quinlan. Coming off 158 hitouts in 1982, Quinlan was the prototypical forward who took forward 50 ruck duties over well before the role's popularity exploded in the 2020s, and he uses all of that experience to leap for the ball, just wanting it more than Mew does. He grabs it but faces away from the goal. He turns but is surrounded by 3 Hawks, Mew, Kennedy and Robertson, who all wrap him up. Somehow, Quinlan swings around, sidesteps, making Kennedy cannon into Robertson, both exiting the tackle. Only Mew is left holding him from behind, allowing him to drop the ball onto his left foot. But it isn't over. Lee Matthews, the biggest, baddest bastard in league football, is right in front of him, so a dribble or low kick isn't an option. So is David Polkinghorne, who helpfully does not elect to prevent Quinlan's slow effort at kicking the ball, perhaps an indicator of why he was dropped for the Hawks next game. His nephew would later play for Quinlan's team, winning a game late with a goal from 60. Sounds very Quinlan-like. Somewhat interesting. Anyway, Quinlan's kick is a high up and under, clearing Matthews. But uncharacteristically for the super boot, there's no distance on it. Well, what do you expect? He was being dragged to the ground in his kicking motion. Polkinghorne sprints, jogs back to the line to cover it, but it just clears his head. Bernie Quinlan has kicked a goal 40 years ahead of his own time to put the Lions in front at the death in a final. This is the most consequential goal he will ever kick in a career that will span 366 games and yet only 11 finals. But this Hawks team is a hungry, burgeoning empire under one of the greatest ever coaches in Alan Jeans. But the Roys lock the ball in their forward 50. They get a ruck clearance. The ball spears towards McMahon, but under pressure, he drops it. Terry Wallace sweeps it up, bombs it to Peter Knights. He's wrapped up, gets it clear, but Fitzroy recovers. They win a free on the wing. With a minute left, that might well be enough if they can just get a mark up front and a shot off. His kick is off target, but Nettlefold grabs it, hoists it again to McMahon, but Ayres beats him in the marking contest. Never mind that he dropped it, this sort of shit was called a mark all the time back then. Watch any of the North Grand Finals, it's actually kind of diabolical, but consistent. He dishes to Mew. His kick finds a 2-on-1. I think Parrish might be the one. He does a great job in effecting a spoil, but only finds Schwab on the outside. He lofts one up, and there's Colin Robertson, a whole TV screen to himself. He runs, but gets greedy. The pass option is lost to him. He is corralled and can only snap to the square. It's another 2-on-1, Hawthorn's way. Glenn Coleman, quiet all day, does an amazing job and punches it away. I've read accounts of what happens next from Fitzroy fans, and I was expecting something shocking. In a second, a literal second, will come a call that will shape this game. Fitzroy fans view it as maybe the worst decision ever made, an injustice, a mistake, a robbery. And here's where I upset every Fitzroy fan, probably again. You're wrong. The ball flies in the air. Richard Loveridge is there for Hawthorn. Gary Pert, one of the young phenoms down back for the Roys, sees him, sees the ball glittering in the sky above his head, and goes all in. One problem. Loveridge has overcommitted. He's missed it. Pert realises this about half a moment too late, sees Loveridge stop, about to turn, and realise that he's overcommitted too. He slams, full-bodied, square into Loveridge's spine. That's a push in the back. Stonewall every day of every week of every year. A correct and honestly a brave call by the umpire Glenn James. Look at Gary Pert. he knows it. In fact, he knows it so much the umpire hasn't even got his whistle in his mouth and he's already berating himself. There's no words of argument, no wild gesticulation that typified an era in which umpire dissent was not just normalised but encouraged and laughed at. Just a young kid who's made a mistake under pressure and happened to foul his opponent in the worst position and time possible. Pert's heart sinks as Loveridge's kick passes right over his head. Hawthorn won the match by 4 damn points and would go on to win the flag by a then record margin. And here's where I upset every Fitzroy fan again. Yes, this side was a spirited outfit that was capable of knocking off great teams on their day, but this side was also young, comparatively unfit, and didn't really work under pressure all that often. It had good players, great players, but their opponents had more. Look, case in point, say Fitzroy did win this game. Do you really think they beat North in the semi, a North side that averaged almost 127 points per game? Even if they do, and they did have the best defence of the year after all, does it not fall apart for them in the granny against Hawthorn or Essendon? My point is proved in the real-world semi-final that Fitzroy plays against the Bombers, in which, yes, they are competitive, but against a tough and hard-running Bombers, they fold under the pressure and they just run out of tickets at the end. Lions fans say that this was the year, the best chance, and look, it was. But they were a Corolla at Bathurst, the best in their class by far, of course, but they were up against V8-powered teams in Hawthorn, Essendon and the Roos. Yes, they had a 5-3 record against top 5 teams this season, but finals were a different story. These sides were baked in finals environments by this point. Fitzroy didn't know what the hell they were, and it showed. And so it ends here. Fitzroy will have 2 more finals campaigns, one of which will go rather deep, but this was the final real, tangible chance, it seemed. This was the last tilt while the Roys had a stable base. With Junction Oval, the Lions had facilities and a ground that could not only properly develop their players, but attract new ones of quality despite their cash flow issues. Junction Oval was their life preserver. And, in a matter of months, it was about to be taken away. Fitzroy were about to be left up the junction.